All right, everyone, we're gonna get started. Welcome to embracing a data-driven approach to network automation. Over the next half hour, we're going to talk about a few different areas, really starting with the common path to network automation. And this is going to be a little bit different, I would say. I think Dave in one of the keynotes talked about enterprise, and I think a lot of this is sort of geared towards what I've seen firsthand in sort of various verticals. Not so much, I would say, telco-wise, although I would say as a business we've engaged quite a bit with a few telcos as well. Introduce a concept called source of truth for the network. Past couple of years, it's kind of growing in the overall space, kind of dissect what that means. We'll introduce Nautobot, which is an open source project, and then kind of wrap up with really kind of seeing it come to life and kind of look at what data-driven network automation is in action in real life. So who am I? Born and raised, proud of it, coming from New Jersey. I would say it's been a while being in the Valley and really appreciate getting out here. And my career networker, I spent about 13, 14 years working for companies like Cisco and Presidio. I would say doing the traditional networking thing, routing, switching, wireless security, and so forth. 2010 or 11, OpenFlow sort of came about, and I was young and naive, thought things were going to change overnight, and just became obsessed with sort of like the future of networking. I became an early evangelist for just change, and kind of looking at where a lot of the startups were going back then. Still saw a gap in really just simply put, network management. Right, there wasn't a lot of focus around just doing better management and really transforming the operational models of networks. That led me to leave where I was. I started a company called Network to Code. 10 years old this year. It's a pretty crazy, time flies, but the sole focus really is just helping people and companies transform with network automation. Over the years, I've been a co-author as well. The O'Reilly book on the left is now 7 years old, and the book on the right is coming out within the next several weeks as well, which is the latest book, about how to use Nautobot for network automation. So pretty neat. So the title, Embracing a Data-Driven Approach to Network Automation. I'll take a few steps back, kind of dissecting some of these words, kind of going back to some of the basics, just based on sort of some of the things that I hear day to day across the industry. The first is, what is a network? I feel like in most discussions, that I kind of see publicly, even in certain forums like this, like there's so much on cloud and going into cloud native and Kubernetes and those networks. And I would say like the world that I'm in, sort of personal day to day, at Network to Code, it's data centers, right? Retail stores, enterprise campuses, universities, K through 12, like there's just so many types of networks, and from wireless to DMZ to branches, and there's so many more. I point that out because I just think if all we read was the latest articles coming from media outlets, you would think that the cloud networks are the only networks that exist. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today is kind of looking at just unified approaches to managing networks of all sizes and shapes. And so for network automation, what does that mean? I would say, for the way I see it every day is it's way more than config management. That's kind of like the shorthand version. But you think about the governance of an asset or an IP address, right? The visibility, the configuration, right? It's all of these things. How do we do all of these things in a unified manner, right? Independent of the network type. Otherwise, we get so siloed in terms of the management and the automation per domain. You kind of forget about how do we bring it all together. Common path to network automation, or some of the areas that I'm seeing out there. First and foremost, self-service. We get engaged with various organizations over the past 10 years, and I would say that the vast majority have some sort of self-service, functional, not sexy portal being used for various things. Maybe it's provisioning an IP address, or getting the next available IP address from an IPAM system. Maybe it's configuring a VIP or for a load balancer, a new app being deployed. Could be backups. Maybe it's running these 3 commands on these set of 5 or 10 or 20 devices. Usually it's transactional, right? Web-driven. just not stateful, right? Just sort of over the years looking at the low-hanging fruit or tickets, a lot of tickets for this one task, so we're going to add a new link, a new quick link, right, on this portal. The second pillar here is called build scripts. I'll give credit to a person named John Willis in the community of DevOps over the past 12, 13 years. Predating Puppet and Chef in that space, there was a phrase he used called Bob scripts. And you kind of go in to sort of paint the picture of the future, and it would be, Bob in a room, arms crossed, and he would have his bash scripts, Perl scripts, and not want to do anything new. But if Bob was out, no one can automate. And when his team members used his scripts and they broke, only Bob could fix them. Bill's an evolution of Bob, but for networking, right? So now we kind of have, Bill, Mary, Jane, anybody in the room that's these days in networking, right? It could be Python, right? It could be a little bit of Perl, been around for a while. It could be Go, but it's still really like it's still individual-based automation, right? So if the change window is occurring, then that person is okay, right? With the sheer luck, maybe it's being shared, but when things break, Bill's on PTO, Bill's on holiday, right? He leaves the organization, the automation typically dies with them. Ansible, just calling it out as an example, it's sort of been the de facto over the past couple of years, where I was involved in the early days in 2014, 2015, building some of the first modules for Ansible for networking, and it really took off over the last 10 years. And it's been that like the de facto start. It kind of gets people looking at team-based automation. You're versioning things. You have YAML files, Jinja templates. You have playbooks, maybe custom modules and filters and things like that. And could be Terraform in the cloud, right? It's just sort of like the evolution of going from sort of like this build scripts, individual scripts to evolve to a team-based approach. Then SDN, right? Kind of par for the course out here, but I would say we've seen a lot of benefits, right, over the years. I would say, namely operationally, we're managing controllers and not tens of thousands of devices, right? But we still end up with multiple controllers. Right now, data center controllers, campus controllers. If you're in the cloud, more controllers. You have firewall provisioning and firewall domain managers and load balancer domain managers. They still end up with these multiple control points that have to get managed. And when you think about the integration of these in a given environment, you might want to reuse policy across one domain into another domain, right? As an example, still kind of see some of these problems emerge. So I love Shark Tank, right? They're on for a while. Stop the madness, right? So we want to do better. And there's always a better way, right? From today to tomorrow to the next day, there's going to be better ways. And for this talk, for this discussion, right, it's around data. How do we forget about some of this last mile automation or how we're doing some of the connectivity to the devices and start thinking about it as data? How do we start to think about the intended state of the network just strictly as data, not necessarily how a vendor might want us to think about that automation or that configuration, right, on their given system? It could be a device or a controller. So now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about this concept of a network source of truth. This is a primitive example, just thinking about the intentions, right? I think we'd all probably opt to live on the top, but maybe based on part of the world or country, maybe the bottom, wouldn't be so bad. But it's very obvious we have to think about the intentions, right? To think about just like the parts and the labor, the configurability. How might we want to adapt a house in the future? What if a fence wasn't there in the beginning, but you want to add it? You want to add an extension or have room for plans in the future. Just understanding the adaptability, extensibility, and so forth. At the end of the day, it's really thinking first about intentions of where we want to get to. And in our world, you kind of think about it, where have our intentions been? Right, over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been so many files that have been pulled up to share IP addresses or ASNs and VLANs, and nowadays, the G Suite might be on here, right? Just based on being 2024 in Confluence, and we've had customers that literally have multi-year projects to kind of aggregate their data across all of these and a dozen more systems. Not on here, probably should have added it. Internal databases, custom databases, very common, right? Larger scale enterprises and telcos, a lot of internal custom databases that have evolved and grown over the years. Then there's the network, right? To think about, like, that's the intended state, but all we really have is that to show us. So is that really what we meant, is to do a show config and recognize that's what we wanted? We don't know. So again, we kind of have to do better in this mindset. But we're in this evolution, right? It's not going to change overnight. Right? 10 years ago, I thought we were going to shift overnight when sort of OpenFlow emerged, and we had 24 startups, attract a lot of VC funding, and things didn't really go as quick as I would have thought, right? Being young and naive. But we're in this progression right now. You have spreadsheets, and we're seeing the progression, right? When we start looking at these DevOps tools, it could be Ansible, kind of point out, you naturally are kind of forced to go down this path, right? If you're building a playbook or a script, you could embed commands and data inside of it, but it's very common to decouple the two. You might have your script or your playbook or whatever automation tooling is being used, and then have some YAML files and data files, right, being read, maybe even a lightweight database. But then we see YAML, great to get started, teaches concepts, or you're versioning those files, but then you realize you do have a large network. You have thousands and thousands of lines of YAML in one file, let alone thousands of YAML files to think about how do we manage that, right, with larger teams. Then the progression here is to outgrow YAML for certain use cases and consider having a database, right? Internal, off the shelf. So we're going to spend more time kind of mentioning that piece and how they kind of can work together, going from YAML to database to store this intended state of the network. So this whole idea of source of truth is that intended state. More about data is kind of this concept of codifying designs, right? Yeah, I've seen these 100-page documents, right, over the years. Sort of you have a new design, data center design, whatever it might be, branch site design, campus building designs. You have why things were chosen, the architecture, the design, product selection, connections, cables, interfaces, IP addresses, right? Really, in a Word document or a wiki. It could be a wiki these days. But then it's up to the engineers to be able to follow that document when they're doing a deployment. More often than not every engineer is gonna follow it. So nowadays it's about, let's codify the design, right? We really want the fewest inputs from a user to generate the required data. Easy example is just in the data center, right? Enter your quantity of leaf switches, maybe you're adding capacity to the network, so we're gonna add 10 leafs, click a button, and generate all the data required, right? IP addresses, VLANs, host names, routing protocol configuration, data, and then have that data that would reside in a database, in a source of truth. Then automation tools, pick your poison, right? Could be custom, could be Ansible, could be Terraform, could be commercial tools, open source, whatever it might be. We'll then fetch the data to then reconcile and do deployments, right, on the network. But this really forces us to think about the decoupling of data from configuration. Right? Example on the syntax on the right, it kind of showcases what's in the orange and in the table is the data. Right? Like think as data, but more often than not in the past couple of years, right? Past 20 years, past couple of decades, we're thinking about syntax. We're thinking about API calls to a device for the commands. But the discussions earlier on, architecture and design, think about the data, then sort of, they will eventually have to get merged together for deployment, but it really changes the mindset around thinking about data first. Ultimately, we see this as kind of designs generating data, and then that data then later driving automation. We'll bring it to life even more thinking about some common use cases on the network. I kind of think about this a lot around the perception. I feel like any task on the network is always 5 words or less. Right? We're going to bounce a port, we're going to assign an IP address to a port, all of these things. It's always very short phrases. Deploying a new service, L3 VPN, it's always a phrase. But when you kind of break it down, like there is a longer process internally from change control, change management, backup processes. ensuring the network is in the state you thought it was before you make the change, right? All of these things. Let's say we finish that change in reality, but then we think about how did we actually know which IP address we should have used, or which ASN, right? Any of those data points in a configuration, right? Could be a controller, could be a device, any vendor. How did we inherently know it was that data, right? Certain size networks, right? People might just know. They might know where to go to look, might know where to go and ask. You know, we've engaged with, you know, a lot of different users, and there was one. It was, you know, Stella stores the IP addresses. You know, it was almost like thinking about it as there's a lot of these code names internally for tools. You know, we thought Stella was an IPAM. It was a person, right? And it was, you know, it was one person who owned the master spreadsheet around IP addresses. And so it's, how do we know how many neighbors, you know, should be there before and after? Right? Like there's so many data points when you think about, right, production networks across different domains. This comes back to source of truth, being able to define that intended state, whatever we call it, but to define the state that we think the network should be operating in. And it could be a combination of configuration state and operational state, right? The more advanced deployments, you know, would have defined data to define thresholds of routing tables and CPU and all these other attributes. So now I'm going to introduce Nautobot as a source of truth that's open source. Nautobot's been around for roughly three and a half years. It was February of 2021. And I'll break it down to kind of be as simple as possible here with the big icon on the bottom. Right, at its core, Nautobot's a networking database, right? So we can store a lot of networking data in Nautobot, starting with inventory, IP addresses, VLAN, security policies, even racks and rack elevations and circuits, right? Deployments that we've seen, you know, we call it, this might be the authoritative source of certain data, or it might not. When it's not, there'll be some integration and synchronization, aggregation of data to one or more systems. Right? You know, we've seen dozens of data sources be used, but effectively, the data, when it's unified, allows you to present it via a single API. That way, data can be fetched more easily when you're trying to verify the intended state of the network. Once all this data is inside and stored in a source of truth like Nautobot, then Nautobot doubles as an automation platform, right? It's optional, right? It's open source, like you kind of pick the use cases, but the primary use case has been about data, right? Define that intended state as data, right? Zero to do about syntax of a given vendor. Once this data is stored in a database like Nautobot, you can then drive automation from the data. So you can use any tool that you want. Again, we'll say the easy ones like a Python or Ansible, Terraform. Again, pick your poison. Or there's the functionality. There's those 12 rectangles. They're called Nautobot apps. They're open source too. If you want to use them, then that's great. You kind of integrate the app, and you can start to drive automation from the data stored from that intended state. On all open source, right? GitHub.com/Nautobot is the GitHub organization. And there's dozens of repos just in the ecosystem, from collections and providers and a whole bunch of stuff. Here's a very simplistic view inside, a detailed view of a device. You get location hierarchy, right? If this already exists in an asset management system, right, then they could be integrated. But you can get really deep in terms of location hierarchy, right? From campus to a building to a floor, to an IDF, to a room, to a rack, right? Really to get pretty granular there. Then you have kind of on the bottom roles and platforms and status and manufacturers and device families. So there's a lot of attributes of a given device as an example to allow more flexibility in the sense of which devices do you want to automate, that are stored in Nautobot. Then you kind of get, well, what happens if there's no model in Nautobot for that data? And on the right, we're kind of showing one basic integration around integrating data in Git. Right? So very common these days to have YAML files, JSON files, whatever it might be. Follow your current process, your CI pipelines, have a system or a person merge it. As soon as that data is merged, that data can then be, through the UI or the API Nautobot, be integrated into Nautobot. Best of both worlds in the sense of hardened data models, and then also sort of the more flexible path around YAML, and kind of bring those two together in the same interface. And pretty granular in terms of data hierarchy, right? Global data, site data, device data, kind of order of precedence would win out as an example. Developer API is pretty rich, right? I kind of highlighted the routing option in the navbar, just because it's not there out of the box. It's an open source sort of add-on, but you can add whatever you want through, it's a Python Django framework. So through following the processes and procedures in the developer API, you can kind of add pages wherever you want, right? In Nautobot. Most common use case is adding data models, right? You might want to have just sort of the models that represent data, how you view data. Service models, right? Very common, pretty unique. So it could be building service models that you would just extend through the developer API and then visually see them. Even this middle one, device lifecycle, it's actually an add-on to Nautobot, and it's an open source app that you can optionally add. Add APIs. It could be adding APIs, facade APIs, wrapper APIs over current data, or again, add your own data models, add your own APIs. Then typically, the more data you're storing, you're usually doing it to drive automation, right? So one option is there's the idea of these jobs in Nautobot that simplistically, it's Python code. It could be a Python script or a full-blown application that's exposed via Nautobot, or again, use your current automation tooling and just fetch the data via the APIs in Nautobot. REST APIs, GraphQL, pretty good, pretty solid APIs. So pretty flexible in the sense of just building off of an open source platform. If you want to build apps, there's also an open source cookie that would allow you to sort of just template the process out and probably save a whole bunch of hours, right? Just pre-builds a directory and gets it ready to even be versioned in Git, following a lot of best practices we've seen over the last 3.5, 4 years. So if we adopt the source of truth and we're defining the intended state, what does that look like? So there's two examples that I'm gonna run through. The first is what I've called rule-driven compliance. This is just the past 20 years, how compliance has been done in networks. And it's really defining rules for every feature. I'll take an easy example like NTP. Typically there's rules every time the data is different. NTP servers in Asia-Pac, NTP versus in the US and EU and so forth. And so these rules grow quite heavily if it's based on the data, maybe based on the vendor syntax, right? Pretty granular. Perform backups and compliance, and you kind of get your compliance, so you do get your outcome. Then on the bottom half of this, you think about it. At that point, you have a compliance tool or a solution, but you can't really use it to drive broader network automation. And in the end, you kind of just deal with exceptions by adding more rules. With this sort of this mindset shift with being data first, data driven, where we end up is thinking about the end state, right? Start at the end state in mind and define your data. Just mentioning NTP. You might have global servers as your fallback, regional servers in the US, EU, Asia-Pac. So you're defining data at maybe a region level in this example, generating the intended configurations, do backups, and you kind of do your simply diff to get compliance. So everything is sourced from the intended state data. And the great part about this idea and this solution, that data can then be used to drive remediation or any other automation tool or project that exists. So you don't end up with a compliance tool and then a whole different stack to define source of truth and automation. Right? This is sort of data driven from the start. That data then can drive anything that you're trying to do on the network. And here exceptions are gone. Right? All you're really doing is ensuring you have good, clean, accurate data. Again, not easy to do, but just like thinking about the data first really is a game changer. Another open source project in the ecosystem here is called Golden Config in the Nautobot space. This does compliance and remediation, and again, open source, uses a lot of libraries under the covers, and all extensible, right? If you're trying to add more and more vendors to be supported. Second use case is just really thinking about user experience. We've seen a lot over time and over the years in the sense of supporting internal teams, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, It could be ServiceNow, it could be chat ops. Again, it could be a self-service form in Nautobot, or pick your internal tool that you can't get rid of because it's just like the front end everybody loves. With the data-first approach, you can sort of power any one of these or all of them to cater to different personas. It could be the service desk, it could be the help desk, it could be the NOC, right? It could be security teams. You want to kind of give them the view that makes sense for them. What we've seen without data-first approach is kind of you kind of have end stacks, or you kind of have the ServiceNow stack or the chat ops stack, and all that logic is sort of embedded in code and not just sort of in the data. Like change the data and have your triggers, right? Sort of lower level in that stack. So data first really just focuses on that vendor neutrality, and then just different presentation layers, right, into that data, as an example. So when you think about sort of the data-first approach, just sort of like start with some high-level questions around, what data is used to configure the network. We've seen, most that I've seen is probably like 60 data sources. It was a combination of spreadsheets, just knowing, internal custom tools, large enterprises, just sort of trying to go through all these sources. If you were gonna do a show config on a device and regenerate that configuration, you'd be pulling data from literally 60 data sources. Right? That's a high number, but usually it's more than one, right? It's always more than one. Data governance, right, comes up a lot in large organizations around who owns a piece of data, right? Is it classified in the sense of maybe that data is used to drive automation, right? Maybe there is certain data classification that should not be automated in a certain, even change windows, right? Or change windows codified, right? All of these things can be kind of stored in a given model in a platform like Nautobot, or it could be any other platform or tool as well. Operational metrics, workflows, how are they codified with data? Once we do kind of identify a data strategy, source of truth strategy, then the execution and the workflows kind of become a lot simpler. If the data is where you need the data to be, at that point you're kind of just fetching the data and generating the right API calls or the command sets, right, to a given device. And really over the lifetime, the past 10 years, right, in the business that I've been in, the first 5 or 6, it was automating tasks, right, a lot of logic in those tasks, graduated to workflows. You kind of got to 3, 4, 5 large workflows, and it was just like, there was a point of so much more investment without data to take a step back to say, hey, you know what? It makes sense to have this data-first strategy, and that really was the emergence of Nautobot, almost 3.5, 4 years ago, and it really has changed, what we've seen as being successful, right, in these larger deployments that we've done. And Nautobot, as I mentioned, everything I talked about is open source, right? It's a pretty active community. It's on GitHub, probably 24 or more open source projects, right? Helm charts and Ansible collections and Python SDKs and so forth. There's sandboxes and there's docs. The Slack community is pretty awesome. And then the latest book, so shameless self-plug, it ships in about 6 weeks, but you can pre-order it on Amazon should you want to dive in. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? More than happy. Otherwise, I'll be hanging out for the next 5 minutes down in front. Question?
So, your scope of truth is on the Nautobot. Conceptually generating your network, or it's defined your network of that. But what do you use? What operating systems do you use? What other tool that takes that data and generates network configuration for each device and sets up BGP?
Mm-hmm.
Brings up the entire network and validates that the connections are corrected.
Right.
Apples are set correctly. VLANs are set right now.
Right.
What's that stage?
Yeah. There's a few things there. I would say, in the interest of time, I'd call out like the one Nautobot app that's open source. It's sort of a loosely coupled application that still relies on users to build Jinja templates. That's it's their standard, right? Your golden standard for a configuration, right? So if you do have 3 vendors, right, it's on the user to build those templates in a Git repo, then they're pulled in to Nautobot, right? So Nautobot isn't meant to be, it can do a lot, but it's really kind of loosely coupled in the sense of you're defining the data in Nautobot, you're defining your templates outside of Nautobot, we bring them in, generate the configurations, and then optionally deploy them from Nautobot as well. Right, so then you would then, on a scheduled job, run compliance on that configuration state. Out of scope for Nautobot is like the operational state, right? Meaning the config looks great, but for some reason the BGP peer is down. Right? That's not caught right now in Nautobot. You can extend it to do it, but I would say it's all configuration state and ensuring that exists on the device. But the heavy lifting, right, in terms of building those templates, that's still on the user to do. I'm hoping in the future with AI, I think we can auto-generate some of that, but otherwise, if you have digital templates today, they could be reused, right? Reused inside Nautobot. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, once again, thanks everyone.